The wind, sharp as a whetted blade, tore at Alara's threadbare shawl, whipping strands of her dull brown hair across a face already chapped raw by days of exposure. Every breath was a rasp, every step a fresh ache in her frost-nipped feet. The sun had long abandoned the desolate western plains, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple, now rapidly bleeding into an inky blackness. Around her, the land stretched, an endless, skeletal whisper of sagebrush and rock, offering no comfort, no shelter. She had seen nothing, heard nothing, but the constant, mocking drone of the wind and the frantic beat of her own heart against her ribs. 3 days. 3 days since the fever took Mama, then Papa, their shallow graves marked by a cairn of loose stones near the dried-up creek bed, a monument to a dream that had turned to dust. She was 17, barely a woman, yet suddenly orphaned, adrift in a wilderness that cared nothing for her tender years or her crushing grief. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a hollow, ceaseless ache, and the cold was a creeping paralysis, seeping into her very bones. Panic, a wild, untamed thing, threatened to overwhelm her, but a stubborn ember of defiance flickered deep within. She had to survive. She had promised them. Then a flicker, a faint, impossible glow in the vast, devouring darkness. Smoke, thin and tenuous, rising against the last vestiges of twilight. Her heart lurched, a violent flutter of hope and terror. Person. But who? This far out, away from the sparse trails and even sparser settlements, a solitary figure was as likely to be a threat as a savior. Yet, the cold was relentless, the hunger a torment, and the night pressed in, thick with unseen dangers. Her options had dwindled to one: approach or perish. She moved with an agonizing slowness, each step a deliberate act of will. The ground was uneven, treacherous in the fading light. As she drew closer, the glow resolved into a small, defiant campfire, spitting sparks into the air. Beside it, silhouetted against the meager flames, was a man. He was large, his frame broad and unyielding, cloaked in a heavy, dust-caked duster. A wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but even from a distance, he exuded an aura of solitary purpose, of quiet, formidable strength. He sat motionless, stirring something in a small pot over the fire. Her throat was tight, her voice a dry whisper. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, but the cold was a more immediate, tangible enemy. She took a deep breath, the frigid air burning her lungs. "Sir." The word was barely audible, a fragile thread woven into the wind's howl. The man didn't startle, didn't flinch. Only his head tilted infinitesimally. A long, silent moment stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. Alara felt his gaze, heavy and assessing, even though she couldn't see his eyes. He was judging her, weighing her, calculating. The silence was more terrifying than any shout. Finally, she forced herself to take a step closer, her voice trembling but clear. Desperation lent her a strange, desperate courage. "Please, sir, I'm lost." And, alone, she swallowed, the words catching. "I need safe passage. Just for the night. Can you act to be my father for just tonight?" The plea was born of a raw, childlike vulnerability, a desperate gamble. To evoke pity, to suggest an innocence she barely possessed, to ward off the predatory glance of any man who might see her as prey. Her chest heaved, the breath tearing through her. The offer was absurd, yet it was the only shield she could think to raise against the vast, indifferent world. The man's hand, which had been idly stirring the pot, stilled. The silence deepened, becoming heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions. Alara braced herself for a harsh refusal, a dismissive wave, perhaps even outright hostility. She watched him, her gaze fixed on the shadow cast by his hat, desperate to glean some indication of his thoughts. The flickering firelight danced across the planes of his weathered face as he slowly lifted his head. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of storm clouds, dark and deep, holding an ancient weariness she couldn't fathom. They held no warmth, but no immediate malice either, only a profound, assessing stillness. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply studied her, his gaze sweeping over her gaunt frame, her tattered clothes, the raw fear etched into her young face. Alara felt stripped bare, every vulnerability laid open. She imagined he saw the endless miles she had walked, the graves she had left behind, the cold, gnawing terror of being utterly, irrevocably alone. A flicker, barely perceptible, passed through those storm-gray eyes. Pity? Recognition? She couldn't tell. "Father!" His voice was a low rumble, rough as stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. It held no inflection of amusement or anger, just a blunt, stark question. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking, to any who might ask. For tonight, just until dawn, she couldn't elaborate, didn't need to. The unspoken threats of the road, the assumptions made about a lone girl, hung in the frigid air between them. The protection wasn't from him, but because of him. He held her gaze for another long moment, then slowly lowered his hand to the pot, resuming his methodical stirring. "Sit," he grunted, nodding towards the opposite side of the fire. It was not an invitation, but an instruction, devoid of warmth, yet a reprieve. Alara's legs felt like jelly. She sank to the dusty ground, pulling her shawl tighter around her, positioning herself across the small flames from him. The heat was a blessed comfort, seeping into her numb fingers and toes. The aroma of cooking beans and salt pork, though faint, made her stomach clench with an unbearable hunger. She watched him cautiously as he scooped a portion of the stew into a tin plate and pushed it across the dirt towards her. "Eat," he commanded, his eyes not leaving hers. She hesitated, then reached for the plate, her fingers trembling as they closed around the warm metal. The first spoonful was ambrosia, rich and savory, a burst of life after days of near starvation. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, acutely aware of his presence, his silent watch. He ate too, his movements economical, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness every few minutes, a sentinel against the unseen. His name, she learned in a terse exchange later, was Silas. He offered nothing more, asked for nothing. They sat in a shared silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of a distant coyote. Alara, buoyed by the food and the strange, quiet safety, began to observe him more closely. He had a scar, thin and white, that bisected his left eyebrow. His hands were calloused, strong, the hands of a man who worked with the land or wrestled with its harsh realities. She saw his rifle propped close, ready. She had sought a father and found a wolf, a solitary, dangerous wolf, perhaps, but one who, for some inexplicable reason, had granted her a brief, fragile shelter within its den. And in that, she found a strange, unsettling peace. The morning dawned with a brutal efficiency, the sky a bruised canvas, promising nothing but more hardship. The wind, though lessened, still carried a bite. Alara awoke stiff and sore, but the gnawing hunger had subsided, replaced by a dull ache. Silas was already up, dousing the remnants of the fire, his movements as fluid and silent as the rising mist. The just tonight had stretched implicitly into another day. She knew, with a certainty that transcended words, that she could not make it alone. The land had become a vast maw, ready to swallow the unwary. "Where are you headed?" Silas asked, his voice low, as he packed their meager camp. It was the most direct question he had posed. Alara hesitated. "West. There's supposed to be a mission far west. A place for lost souls." It was a vague hope, a rumor she'd heard from her parents before their descent. A last, desperate destination. He grunted, a noncommittal sound, but didn't argue. He simply mounted his horse, a sturdy bay, and motioned for her to take hold of the stirrup. The implication was clear. She would walk, and he would ride, but he would not abandon her. And so, their strange journey continued, a silent procession across the endless, ochre plains. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the shifting textures of the land, the constant, weary rhythm of her steps. Silas remained a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He shared his meager rations without complaint, always ensuring she ate first. He pointed out safe paths, watched for signs of trouble, his eyes constantly sweeping the horizon. Once, when a lone, mangy wolf too bold for its own good shadowed them, he had simply dismounted, fired a single warning shot into the air, and remounted, all without a word. The wolf vanished. His presence was a palpable shield, a quiet, unwavering strength that began to chip away at Alara's fear, replacing it with a tentative, growing sense of security. She, in turn, found a quiet strength within herself. She learned to spot water sources, to identify edible plants, to read the subtle signs of the land. The vulnerability that had driven her desperate plea began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. She was no longer just a lost girl. She was a survivor, learning from the silent teacher beside her. One late afternoon, as they crested a low ridge, Silas reined in his horse sharply. His body stiffened, his gaze fixed on a distant plume of dust rising steadily from the west. Alara felt a chill colder than the wind. His quiet stillness was more alarming than any shout. "Riders," he murmured, his voice tight. "More than two. And moving fast." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had told him nothing of her past, of any specific threat, but a fear had always lingered. Perhaps her parents' illness wasn't the only reason for their hurried journey west. Or perhaps, in this lawless land, any lone traveler, particularly one with a girl, was a target. "Outlaws?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas shook his head, his jaw tight. "Too organized. Too direct. Like they're looking for something. Or someone." His eyes met hers, sharp and searching. "Are you in trouble, girl?" The question, unasked until now, hung between them. Alara's mind raced. Her father's warnings, their hurried departure, whispered rumors of a greedy baron who coveted their fertile claim. Her parents had resisted, then the fever. These men, an echo of that old threat. She nodded slowly, her throat tight. "Our land. There was a man, he wanted it. And we wouldn't sell." Silas's lips thinned. "They've been tracking you." His gaze scanned the terrain, seeking an advantage. He dismounted, pulling his rifle. "No time to run. We make our stand here." Fear, cold and paralyzing, threatened to consume her. But looking at Silas, his face a mask of grim determination, she saw resolve. He wasn't abandoning her. He was fighting. And in that moment, a similar resolve hardened within her. She was no longer the helpless child. She was part of this. The riders, 5 of them, were close now, their shouts carrying on the wind, their faces grim. Silas pushed Alara behind a cluster of boulders. "Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you." His voice was calm, steady. He took a strategic position, rifle raised, a silent guardian. The first rider, a burly man with a cruel smile, reined in. Well, what have we here?" "A lone wolf and his little lamb. Looking for the girl, old man. Heard her folks finally kicked the bucket. The land's mine now." Silas didn't answer. He simply aimed and fired. The shot cracked, precise and deadly. The burly man cried out, clutching his shoulder, and tumbled from his horse. Chaos erupted. The remaining riders scattered, drawing their weapons. Alara, hidden, watched Silas move, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He fired, reloaded with practiced ease, moved and fired again. 2 more riders fell, their horses rearing and bolting. The remaining 2 hesitated. Then one spotted Alara. He spurred his horse, charging directly towards the boulders, triumph in his eyes. "Silas!" Alara screamed, a raw sound torn from her lungs. Silas, engaged with the other rider, spun. He raised his rifle, but the rider was too close. In that split second, a primal instinct surged. She grabbed a heavy, jagged rock and threw it with all her strength. It struck the charging horse's flank. The animal shrieked, stumbled, throwing its rider to the dust. Silas's shot then found its mark. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by a wounded horse. Silas stood over the last fallen rider, his rifle smoking. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over Alara. His eyes, no longer shadowed, held a flicker she hadn't seen before, respect, and perhaps a quiet understanding. "You're quick," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Alara slowly rose, her limbs trembling, but her gaze met his without flinching. The terror was gone, replaced by an astonishing sense of self-possession. The father plea had been a desperate shield. Now she stood as an equal, forged in the crucible of shared danger. They buried the dead, a grim necessity. As they moved on, the sun dipping below the horizon once more, the air felt different, lighter. They walked side by side, no longer bound by pretense, but by the quiet, unbreakable bond of shared survival. Alara looked at Silas, this taciturn, formidable man who had unexpectedly stepped into the void of her loneliness. He had not just protected her body, he had helped her unearth the buried strength within her soul. And Silas, looking at her, saw not a lost child, but a resilient woman, a flicker of light in his long darkened world. The open road stretched before them, uncertain, but no longer solitary. They had found, in the desolate vastness, something akin to a future, together.